Okay, it never fails that when I start recording, my dog wants to start barking, drinking loudly, and eating the most. So I apologize. Welcome to video 2 from welcome to video 2 for week 2 and assessment. This one's going to briefly review the stats and math terms that you're going to need to understand and use in assessment in your class when you become a teacher. I also want to go ahead and apologize because it never fails that when I need to record, my dog needs to drink all the water as loudly as possible, eat the most, crunch the loudest, and bark at everything that moves. So, sorry. All right. We're going to replace the word statistics because it scares people with just basic stuff you need to understand assessment, mainly focusing on the measures of central tendency, measures of variability, bell curve, a little bit of reliability and validity. Once again, just like video 1, we are going to dive into these much deeper when we are applying it and practicing it in assignments and in activities in class. So this is not meant to master, but expose and help you to better understand what areas you need more information on. Let's start with the beautiful bell curve, right? You've probably seen this in either your classes or news, social media. I want to point out that here in the middle, this is considered average. Notice I said average. I didn't say normal because what is normal? We are neurodiverse group of people, but that is the average. Or the mean, okay? The measures of central tendency, mean, median, and mode, they're a way to organize data and to see how the data cluster together and are distributed around a numerical representation of the average score. I caution you to use this technique if your scores are widely scattered. Right? If you have students scoring a 10 and a 100 on an assessment, and 4 that scored 30, and 8 that scored 80, and some that scored 50, 60, if they're all spread out, it's difficult to use the mean to get really any information. A normal distribution represents the way test scores would fall if a test was given to every single student of the same age or grade in the population. So rarely is your data going to look like this bell curve, right? And we're going to talk about what it will look like most of the time and when you should have alarms go off. So let's get into just some basic terms to understand what this means. What are these white lines? What are these percentages? And what do they represent? First off, mean. It's average, right? It's useful when you want to know the general level of performance of all the students combined in the class. You use it when the data is evenly distributed. Very few really high or really low scores. The mean accurately can represent the central tendency of the data when you don't have a lot of outliers. We use the mean to just get a sense of the overall performance of the class. So here's an example. If you had all your students here, and that was the total, and then you're going to divide by the number of students, the number of test takers, and that's how you're going to get the mean. The median is the number that falls in the middle of a set of scores. It's found by ranking the data set, each score in the number of time it occurs. So you're going to count halfway down the list of the scores. 50% of the data are listed above the median and 50% are listed below. And in a data set with an even number of scores, the median score would not actually exist in that data set. So we would take 2. So, it's really nice when you have, this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 scores. So 3 are above, 3 are below, and this would be my median. If I had 8 here, there wouldn't be a median, so I would take the 2 in the middle and average those, and that would then become my median score. But why do I use this? The median's the middle score, and when all the data points are arranged in order, it is helpful to use if your data set has a lot of outliers or is skewed, because the median's not affected by extremely high or extremely low values. So the median would give you kind of a better sense of how the group did if you have some outliers, so really high or really low scores. Then you might want to use the median to better understand kind of the group's scores. The mode is the score that occurs the most often in a data set. So you rank the scores from highest to lowest, and you tally how many of each score was obtained, and the mode is the score that occurs the most number of times. So if you have a normal distribution, then the mean, median, and mode would actually be the same. But if you have data that is skewed to the right, then the mean is not going to be, closely representing middle of the pack. At that point, the mode would be a more accurate view of how the class did. So for me, sometimes, honestly, graphing it out lets me know which one would be the most appropriate to use for my class. So for those that know, I study self-regulated strategy development. I am a huge proponent of mnemonics, or things that help you remember. So median in the road, you think it's the middle of the road, so you're looking for the middle number. Or mean, the mean one that makes you add everything and then divide it. Or the mode is the most common. Or there's a riddle here that also adds in range. Hey diddle diddle, the median's in the middle. You add then divide for the mean. The mode is the one you see the most, and the range is the difference between. So whatever works for you to remember is perfectly fine. So what do you do when your data doesn't fall in the norm and you have these outliers? So you really want to start by quantifying the simplest measure of the spread of the data, and that's the range. This at least tells you the boundaries with which the sample heights fall, but the range ignores a lot of contextual information. For example, 2 data sets can have very different spreads, but still have the same range. Like this example, like the highest point is 12, the lowest point is 8. So the range is the same on both data sets. However, the one on the right is definitely not as equally distributed, right? So if you want to avoid undue influence of outliers for the measure of the spread of the data, then the range is not good enough to provide us with a holistic measure. So what's a more stable measurement? And that is variance. So what I want you to understand is why I need to care about variance, right? So if you had all three of these data sets, you can see that, like, imagine that along this line there are little dots, and those are all scores that your students made. But when you calculated the mean, all of the means are the same. But that's not a very good representation of what the data really looks at. Does that make sense? So bell curves that are more squished together are composed of data points that are more similar to one another, and bell curves that are more spread out are composed of data that have greater variance or greater variability. So wider bell curves mean greater variance, and in plain language, the variance gives us an idea of how similar data points are to one another and to the average value. So when I'm thinking about, like, I can't give you a really good answer here of which one do you want to see in your data, because it depends on what are you measuring. But if I had, this data set on the right, and it was, on the higher end, that would make me feel good. That means the majority of my students are grasping a concept, right? If I had this middle one, then I could be able to look at it and figure out small groups and who I need to push forward and accelerate, and who I need to really look at and think about, remediation. Okay, so standard deviation. You have probably heard standard deviation. If this is the mean, then one standard deviation above is above average, and two standard deviations above, you can be categorized as highly gifted. Same with looking down. But what is that? How do they get that line? How do they know what that standard deviation is? And standard deviation is how spread out the numbers are in a data set. So a low standard deviation means that the numbers are close to the mean, while a high standard deviation means that they are more spread out. So a low standard deviation means that there is less variability in the data, and a low standard deviation inspires more confidence that the mean represents the typical case. The standard deviation can also be affected by extreme outliers. And a higher standard deviation means that there's high variability and less agreement in the data. So look at this example. If two classes took a test and both had a mean of a score of 80, but in one class the scores ranged from 78 to 82, but in the other class the scores ranged from 60 to 80, then the first class would have a lower standard deviation and the second class would have a high standard deviation. And when you have a high standard deviation, it should put some pause in, calculating and, cautious of interpreting the data. because we don't know if it's really reflective of the collective experience of the students in the class. So why do I need to care about variability or standard deviation? And if the scores are all close to the average, you'll have a low standard deviation. But why do I care? Why does this matter? A low standard deviation means that most students performed similarly, suggesting that the assessment was likely at an appropriate level of difficulty. The content was well understood by the majority of the class, or really misunderstood by the majority of the class. A high standard deviation, on the other hand, indicates that there were significant differences in student performance, which could suggest that the assessment might have been too difficult or too easy for some students, and that there are varying levels of understanding in the class. The tier 1 level of our class to be understanding concepts. When we are so spread out, it is really hard to meet the needs of all of our students. So when you see high standard deviations, it might be a red flag. It shows that the assessment wasn't, appropriately challenging for some students, or that there are gaps in understanding that need to be addressed. So it doesn't always mean that the assessment was bad. The assessment might have been valid. It may have been gaps in understanding. So just putting pause and paying attention to what these standard deviations mean. So in this graph, the mean of the test scores was 84.47 with a standard deviation of 6.92. We can see the distribution. You can kind of just start to see where the curve is. So many of the test scores are around the average. The average was 84. Many of them fall around this area. There's one student who scored a 96, and there's one student who scored a 69 and a 71, but most students scored close to the 84.7. So it indicates consistency in student performance, which suggests that your teaching was effective for the entire class and that students are mastering the content at a similar pace. But with this one, the mean is 80, and we can still, that's really helpful too when you see this and it's like a dip and then an up again. You kind of know that's going to mess with your mean and your understanding of the data when we've got two humps. The mean's 80 with a standard deviation of 14.57, and it looks like this. So one student was at 24, one was at 96. That range is great. But when we look at the mean being an 80, not a lot of the scores are around that. So it puts pause. So now that we've kind of identified what this mean is, what these standard deviations mean, let's go back to the normal bell curve. So we usually look at it to compare by talking about standard deviations. So the dark blue areas represent one standard deviation above and below the mean. So one above and one below. And 34% of scores fall above and 34% score one standard deviation below, for a total of 68% kind of falling in this norm hump. And scores that fall within this range are considered the average scores. Next to the dark blue are orange sections that represent scores in the second standard deviation above and below the mean. Each orange represents 14% of the scores, so 14% fall above and 14% fall below the two standard deviations above the mean and below the mean. So when we add that together, from orange and blue, that's a total of 96% of the test takers usually fall within the orange and blue. Now, the third and fourth standard deviations, the bright blue and the gray, this is very, very small percentage of people fall here. So these are either the very highly or high gifted or the low to non-performers. And so that's often when we start to do psychological evaluations, 2 standard deviations below, kind of constitute or cutoff points and scores for certain disabilities. But not just one data point. We don't just look at one data point. This is another graphic that represents it. This is similar to the handout that I had in my data notebook when I would have IEP meetings. It helped me to explain and demonstrate, and it had what each category meant, and it was just a nice visual to give to parents. So bottom line, I really want you to understand the 3 measures of central tendency: mean, median, and mode, and walk away just knowing that an average is not always representative of the class average, that just taking the mean, that you really need to look deeper at that data, look for outliers, plot the data on a graph so that you can get a sense of where everyone is. And you can figure out a lot of tests today, iReady, a lot of the diagnostic tests that are given, Dibbles, all of these, they can give you standard deviations, variance. They'll even do item analysis for you, which we'll talk about later. But what about when you give a teacher-made test, or when you're giving your ed TPA? I want you to be able to plot the data, and I want you to be able to confidently choose how to talk about it. Because, think about it, just pro tip, when we only use the mean, we oftentimes run the risk of misrepresenting data. We do not want to, take the average of, having a 0 and putting a 0 in the grade book. That's why I hate to do that, just because someone missed an assignment. Because it can really mess up your whole entire grade. And so is that a representative, score of what you know? No, it's not. So just be mindful of that. And sometimes you might have to advocate for your students. So are we really measuring assessment? Are we really measuring understanding of the content? Or are we measuring, self-regulation skills and professionalism of turning things in on time? Maybe we need to think about how to separate those two. So what, Dr. Owens? What does that have to do with my job? Why do I have to know about this bell curve? And let's take a look at some standard scores and see if your students were to have gotten this score. What would you have done? Or what would you have thought about their performance compared to their peers? So if your first student comes out and the score is 100, and this is what the data looks like, that student's right dab in the middle between their peers, so they don't need any intensive interventions, right? They're right on track. Now the next student has 108, so they're within the average range. They are, within the 1 standard deviation above the mean, but that doesn't mean I need to be, rushing to get them like accelerated materials or anything yet. They're still falling within that average range. Now I got a student that falls in the 73. That's on the middle to low side of the below average. So it's in the 2nd deviation, standard deviation below. And some people say you need a score that's more than 1.5 to 2 standard deviations to consider intensive interventions. But as a teacher, I know that if I had that data in my class, I'd be seeking supports for that student. I'd be figuring out what's going on. How can I give you supports? I'm not going to wait for you to fail harder to start figuring out where you don't understand. So let's don't wait for students to really fail before we care to give them interventions. Let's see and let's pay attention to the data so that when they're close enough, we can quickly grab them and scoot them over, quickly grab and remediate and try to move them closer to the mean. Student with 90 falling in average range, no intervention needed there. 84, right? That's that cusp. That's the one I'm thinking about. So many people say that these numbers are a little bit arbitrary and that if you're on the cusp, that it's so close to the average range that it could have just been a bad day. And it's not as concerning as the student with 73. However, it could be that based on the item or error analysis, that it's a quick remediation, quick small group to move that student closer to the mean. It's like they've almost got it. Now the student with the 62 should probably already be getting intensive interventions because they're down at the low end of the bell curve and almost all of their peers are performing higher than them. They'll really need some intensive interventions and supports to be able to access that general curriculum. Then over here, with the student with 140, now this person's highly gifted, and in Tennessee, gifted is considered a category in special education. So I would be looking for additional supports for gifted students if this hadn't already happened. And just for context, Lady Gaga's over here at 166. Start thinking about what resources you want to add to your data notebook to help you remember these concepts and when to apply and when to use them. So before we move on, I want to take a minute to distinguish between normed reference test and standardized test. Many people use these terms interchangeably and they are not the same. A standardized test is a test that is administered and scored according to a very specific procedure. The data is interpreted in different ways, which we won't get into today. But a normed reference test is one where the scores are compared to other students in a sample. It could be in comparison to students in the same state, nationally, or another type of sample. To truly be a normed reference, ideally we are taking people from all points of the nation, socioeconomic skills, different races, so that we are not getting a skewed bell curve. But here's what I want you to internalize. Not all standardized tests are normed referenced, but all normed reference tests are standardized. And this is kind of like how I used to tell myself. Sorry, my dog. If it has a protocol to read and a time limit and, standardized procedures, then it's going to be standardized. But that standardized test might not have the budget for it to have normed data. So here are a few other terms, okay? So after we administer these assessments and we count how many answers the students got right, the total correct answers on a standardized test, that's the raw score. And the testing manual is going to tell us how to convert that raw score into a percentile. A percentile is actually the rank from 1 to 99. That means that if the student has a percentile rank of 75, that means that 25% of the scores were higher than their score. So the image that comes in my head, and the one that I started to use, a lot in IEP meetings after I got pregnant was my daughter, since she was an embryo, has been measuring and now in the 99th percentile in height. She's just super tall. Dad's 6'4". I'm, not extremely short, but she's just really tall. And so the doctor explained it to me. He was like, if you line up 99 kids that were born on August 22nd, 2014, Edith's going to be taller than 99 of them. And that helped make sense to me. And so sometimes when I was needing to explain that percentile, because if we say 50th percentile, oftentimes what parents and what we kind of internalize is, oh no, a 50's bad, a 50's failing. But a 50th percentile is dead in the middle. So really, sometimes I would draw it out for them. So, get a visual there where they can see. Maybe you draw a number line and you explain, and you show them where they are and how that means, if they're in the 25th percentile, that means 75% of the students that are their age are performing above them. That image can really be powerful for a parent to really understand. These standard scores, where the mean is 100, can be useful to add and subtract from one another and can be useful for comparison across different standardized tests. Now, many standardized tests might also provide an age or grade equivalent. So you might get a percentile, but then you might get an age or a grade equivalent, and that's also very helpful. So, maybe they are performing at the 25th percentile among 10-year-olds, which might put them at, a 7-year-old equivalent score. And you need to be able to talk about this. The school psychologist will explain all of this in the evaluation and eligibility meetings, right? The more you sit through those meetings, the more you're going to internalize these. However, there's not a lot of, eligibility meetings that you can attend all the time. But you're going to get those IEPs that have that data in it. And you're going to need to be able to understand and sometimes request that we reevaluate because that data doesn't always stay current, present levels of performance. If we gave the eligibility comprehensive, test 4 years ago, that's not present level anymore. So maybe we need to push for, that we reevaluate the students to get a better sense of where they are. And that's where I want you to understanding this stuff and understanding how to talk about it and relay it is super helpful. So briefly, we're going to have a whole week where we talk about reliability and validity when we're looking at our test questions, when we create our own test questions. But we want our test to be valid, and standardized test scores, are based on a normal bell curve. And through the development of these tests, it has been shown that these assessments are both valid and reliable. So what does it mean to have a valid, reliable assessment? Validity has to do with the accuracy of the test, and reliability, on the other hand, has to do with consistency. So with validity, this central question is, does this measure what it's supposed to measure? And that is where I see a lot of students struggling. The EdTPA projects I reviewed last semester, they hadn't taken this course. We hadn't really thought about, really thoughtfully thinking through our assessments. And so by the time they came to me, their lessons were filmed and everything was done. And I found myself constantly saying, but your objective is this, but you are not assessing that on your assessment. So is that really a valid assessment? Another thing I like to talk about is if, thinking from a content perspective, if I am a social studies teacher or history teacher, and I am trying to measure a student's understanding of certain historical events, but the assessment I use is an essay, and my rubric, I'm counting off so much for their grammar and spelling and writing that it then, is it really a valid measure of the standard, the history standard anymore? Or does it become a writing measure? Does that make sense? We'll talk about it more in class. So here's an example of validity, and take a look at this picture. Do you think these list of words could test someone's reading skills? Yeah, it would be a valid assessment of reading ability. How about this picture of a student doing addition problems? Is this a valid assessment of reading ability? No, doing math problems is not something that's going to assess reading ability. So it's not a valid measure. But what about reliability? So words are so hard for me right now. Oral word identification is a pretty valid way to test reading skills. We would say this test has validity to test reading ability, but adding numbers does not have validity to testing reading skills. But are the scores consistent across date, settings, and other potential situations that could influence this test? That's measuring the reliability. It may be a valid measure, but is it reliable? If I test the student at 8 o'clock in the morning versus right before lunch versus at the end of the day, how consistent are the scores going to be? And that's going to determine the reliability. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So even though I'm trying to get better, I'm still not 100% great in the mornings. I'm not a very big morning person, so if I took a test at 8 a.m., I would probably, and then one at 2 p.m., I'd probably say I'd do better on the one at 2 p.m. But if we look at the scores, and it's a 92 and a 93, those are pretty close. And by that measure, I would say, yeah, it's a reliable assessment because the time of day did not make the test less consistent. So we really are trying to find an accurate test that's dependable. And so, we want valid and reliable measures, and instruments should have both properties, but may have only one. And it's okay for you to question that. I did a lot in my district. I would question the benchmark assessments that we were given. I would ask for validity and reliability. And oftentimes they don't have those for assessments like that. So just ideally, we would like that. We would like that reported definitely on the normed reference test where we are making major decisions like eligibility decisions. I'm not going to dive super deep into this. Instead, I'm going to let you look at it and form some questions. But this is from our pretest that we gave. 18 out of 19 of you took it. And so, seeing it, I can already see this, a little bell curve. But I'm curious, and I want you to think about it, and we're going to start our class with this conversation next week of the average, the mean, is 62. And do you think that is representative? A representative score? I'm sorry, that's my dog. She's an old lady. And so would you think we should go with the mean, the median, or the mode? And any other questions that you can have just from our pretest. We're going to dive into looking at each questions, then discriminatory index and things like that, but I wanted to just give you a brief intro. So for your formative/summative, I'm letting you take it twice for the sole purpose of allowing you a chance to really self-assess. And if you don't get a question right, then I want you to go back and figure it out. I'm a firm believer that if you aren't given the chance to hit mastery, then are you really going to do it? So, however, there are short answer questions, and so pro tip, copy and paste those onto a Word document. So in case you get to you want to take the second chance, you have those copied over. If you have any questions, please click on the Writer's Wake Up and just exit ticket and shoot me some questions. We will continue to talk about these terms throughout the semester. So once again, this is none of the questions on the formative summative are so hard where I'm asking you to demonstrate mastery. It's more so really trying to assess, do I get the big concepts from this week? I will see you next week. We are going to meet the full entire time. And good luck. Stay cool.